Now, is our EEGs the only way of studying the brain? There are other brain imaging techniques, and again, this is not quite covered. So another thing you should watch out for is that this isn't in either book in depth, but at the same time, there's a lot of information about these imaging techniques, so keep it limited to what I cover in lecture. All right, so the three I definitely want you to know for this class: the CT scan, PET scan, and fMRI. So I'll go over each of those. So computerized axial tomography, or sometimes computerized tomography. That's why you might hear it called a CAT scan if they use the axial, or they might just call it a CT scan. But what do we have here? And we did kind of mention this very early in the semester, what we're looking at. So what we're seeing is many X-rays. So actually taking a series of X-rays and going down an axis of the body. So what we have here is actually a series of X-rays. And just like a typical X-ray, in general on an X-ray, things that are dark are less dense. Things that are very dense, like bone mineral, they appear whiter. So here, what do we see here? We see the ventricles, right? Because they're dark, they're filled with fluid. But we also see the different layers of bone in the skull. And I think if you look at this one, you can see that something pops up here. So you see that white spot? So that white spot that popped up is something very dense. That's actually a brain tumor. So this is one way you're able to detect brain tumors by looking where, hey, is there some sort of dense mass where there isn't supposed to be dense mass? Because again, look at the brain in general. It's just kind of like dark gray color, but when a big white spot shows up like that on the CT scan, that's definitely worth investigating. The great thing is that it's very high resolution. You get detailed images. But at the same time, you're introducing X-rays. So when you're introducing X-rays, there is a chance of DNA damage and damaging cells and causing cancer. So that's why you want to do CT scans all the time, because you are exposing the patient to radiation every time you do a CT scan. But again, if the patient has a potential tumor and you want to find it, it's kind of worth balancing that risk. And also used for severe trauma. The thing is that you not only can detect dense objects, you can also detect liquids and edema or bleeding as well. So that's why you often see CT scans done, like someone's in a car accident and they might do a CT scan of the head to check out the inside of the head, because again, an EEG can only detects electrical impulses at the surface. It doesn't actually produce images like we see here. Okay, so what's a PET scan? PET scans are a little more complicated. So they do involve radiation, but instead of using X-rays, what they do is use radio-labeled chemicals. So hospitals might have a machine called a cyclotron, and you can put chemicals in that, and they kind of add. What they do is what they call radio labeling. So they're able to create isotopes that generate some sort of low levels of radiation. And what they do is measure levels of the radiation from a chemical. So in theory, any chemical can be radio labeled if you're able to use a cyclotron to generate an isotope. So these are lower resolution, and these are frequently used to diagnose brain diseases. And let's show you what a PET scan looks like. So it looks very colorful, and this is actually artificial colors. So what it's actually showing you is like the redder it is, the higher of the activity you see in that area. Whereas bluer, these are low or sometimes no activity. Hey, these are the ventricle, where the ventricle should be, right? Are there neurons in the cerebral spinal fluid? There shouldn't be in the fluid itself, so that's why you don't see any activity. And what we actually see here is radioactive glucose. So glucose, important energy source for your cells. You can easily make that into ATP. So therefore, if there's more metabolism, more neurons, it's going to gobble up the glucose. And when it gobbles up this radio-labeled glucose, it's going to appear bright red in a PET scan. So this is radiation from that radio-labeled glucose. So what we see here in the normal brain, lots of high activity everywhere in the brain. But in the Alzheimer's, what do we see? Well, we see that big ventricles, again, due to that ventricle enlargement, and you don't see as much red. And this person has mild cognitive impairment, so notice that they don't have as much red as the normal patient either. So it's just measuring overall brain metabolism and energy consumption. So less energy, less action potentials, you're going to get a weaker signal, or sometimes a lack of signal if you don't have any neurons there. But is glucose the only thing that can be radio labeled? So what we have here is very interesting. What we're seeing is our dopamine signals. Now look at the normal brain. You have these red centers right here, so high activity. But what we have here is someone who's addicted to cocaine. Do you see the red? We don't see any as much red. Now we see the medium levels of this dopamine. So this is actually a variant so it is like dopamine, but with some more chemical modifications. That's what this is. Don't worry about memorizing this exact term. So just think of it as dopamine, but with radioactive labeling. And here we see lower levels of dopamine. So if you've like had like drug abuse education, I don't know what they call it these days. Back in the day they call it DARE. But the thing is that why do they get addicted and why do people tend to take more and more of these drugs? Well, as they get higher levels of these drugs and they start to get less of a response, they get negative feedback. That's why I think for certain drugs they say they're always chasing the first high because that was when it was the strongest. But this is what we're seeing here. They're using cocaine, but they're not getting that normal high dopamine response. So this obese person's brain. Now this isn't cocaine, but who does it look like? This obese person's PET scan. Does it look more like a normal brain, or does it look more like a person who's addicted to cocaine? Yeah, so if you look at it, do you see red in the obese person's PET scan, or do you see red in the yeah, do you see as much red as the normal or the cocaine addicts? Yeah, so you don't see as much red. So this is the other thing too. You see impaired dopamine signals in this scan of an obese person's brain. So yes, food addiction is real because again, dope addiction and pleasure and rewards all involve dopamine. So again, this is what PET scans are very important because you can measure things like overall activity of neurons. You can measure specific neurotransmitters. If you can radio label it, in theory, you can measure the amounts of levels of it in the brain using a PET scan.